Under the vaulted chamber of the Galactic Council, the voices of 100 species tangled in overlapping arguments. The air carried the cold tang of sterilizers, but it could not mask the sour edge of fear. The topic was not a border dispute or a trade imbalance. It was humanity. Delegates who had never set foot on Earth spoke of it with the unease of those discussing a dangerous animal. Words like unpredictable, aggressive, and volatile recurred in every language. Even the ones that tried to sound impartial betrayed an undercurrent of alarm. The humans had been in the Council for only a few standard years, yet already there were calls for sanctions, restrictions, or outright expulsion. The accusation was framed as logic, as prudent governance. Earth was a Class 6 death world, highest known category for habitable planets. That alone, in the minds of the delegates, was proof that humans were forged in an environment that bred danger. In death world taxonomy, Earth's predators outnumbered its prey, its climate cycles carried lethal extremes, and its biosphere evolved toxins, venoms, and diseases at a frequency other worlds found unimaginable. Every native species from such worlds was rare in the galaxy, but none had thrived enough to reach the stars. Until humans. That uniqueness was less a badge of honor here and more a mark of suspicion. Historical records were weaponized against them. A delegation from the Plenary Alliance presented holos of early human exploration, a salvage crew walking away from a shipwreck in an unbreathable atmosphere, eyes red from leaking oxygen masks, still carrying the recovered data core, a mining outpost in a system racked by magnetic storms, where humans stayed on-site weeks longer than other contractors could tolerate, extracting every ounce of ore before evacuation. An expedition in a collapsed station where temperatures swung from boiling to freezing in hours, the humans improvising shelters from debris and surviving without external aid. To most species, such feats bordered on self-harm. To humans, they were simply doing the job. The human delegate listened without interruption. A tall figure, skin tanned from real sunlight rather than filtered arc lamps, eyes fixed and steady. Their name was Commander Vale in human military records, though the Council insisted on calling them Representative Vale. The rank made the alien blocks uncomfortable. Military ranks carried implications of combat proficiency, and Vale's file contained more than one classified campaign. Rumors claimed they had been decorated for operations that prevented wars before they started, though the details were hidden under human security seals. Rumors also claimed they had personally led assaults in conditions no Council fleet could endure. When Vale finally spoke, it was without flourish. They did not deny Earth's classification. They did not try to soften the image of humanity's resilience. Instead, they dismantled the logic that survival equated to aggression. Your criteria, they said evenly, confuse capability with intent. A blade in a sheath is not an attack. You measure us by what we could do to you, not by what we have done for you. The room bristled. Some delegates shifted. Others narrowed their eyes or flicked their head crests. Vale continued, enumerating instances where human ships had answered distress calls in hostile zones, where human marines had extracted non-human crews from collapsing atmospheres, where human medical teams had set up field hospitals in plague zones others would not enter. The examples were not hypothetical. They were recorded in the Council's own archives. The rebuttal was precise, but it did not dislodge the core unease. Prejudice was stubborn, especially when fueled by fear. A delegate from the Zarin sovereignty spoke of human border patrols engaging in provocative maneuvers. Another from the IRIC coalition accused humans of hoarding military technologies. Vale countered each charge, but with every exchange it became clear. The Council was less concerned with facts than with the implications of human potential. The thought that a species could survive on Earth, reach the stars, and then match or exceed galactic powers in conflict, that was the real threat in their eyes. Between speeches, a quiet thread of rumor wound its way through the chamber. There were whispers of fleet movements beyond mapped space. Merchant captains reported sightings of ships with no transponders, moving in coordinated patterns near fringe colonies. Patrol routes had recorded subtle but growing interference in communication arrays. It was nothing the Council could conclusively confirm, so most dismissed it as border noise. Only Vale seemed to treat the fragments as pieces of a whole. They spent long hours between sessions poring over data feeds, cross-referencing ship vectors with trade logs and pirate reports, drawing a pattern from chaos that the rest ignored. When Vale spoke of it in session, the response was tepid. Some listened politely. Others waved it off as an attempt to distract from the main debate. The Council's fleets are more than capable of handling raiders, one delegate said, their tone almost bored. You have no evidence of a unified force. Vale's reply was sharp enough to cut the room's ambient noise. You're looking for proof after the fact. By the time you get it, you'll be counting the dead. The chamber's tension spiked. It was a kind of language the Council loathed, direct, unvarnished, carrying an implicit accusation of complacency. The chair attempted to pivot discussion back to membership terms, but the undercurrent had shifted. Vale leaned forward, hands clasped loosely on the table. You classify us as dangerous because we come from a world that tried to kill us every day, they said. That world taught us to read the sky before the storm hit, to act before the predators struck. You call it aggression. We call it survival. And survival is the only reason you'll still be here if what I've seen becomes more than rumors. There was no raised voice, no threat, only certainty. Several delegates looked away. Some murmured to aides, sending encrypted messages down to their fleets. The chair called for an adjournment. As the chamber emptied, a few of the more hawkish representatives whispered privately that the human might be exaggerating, playing at fear to secure influence. Others, particularly those from border systems, found themselves replaying Vale's words in their minds. They had seen how quickly the unexpected could sweep through an unprepared world. Outside the chamber, Vale walked alone through the polished corridors, a calm presence amid the Council's ornate excess. They had not come here to make friends, nor to placate old suspicions. They had come because the signs were there, written in the kind of subtle shifts and anomalies that most of the galaxy had long since stopped noticing. The predators beyond the stars would not wait for debates to conclude, and when they came, the Council would have to choose whether to survive on its own terms, or on humanity's. If the Council rejected them now, Vale thought it would make no difference. The storm was coming regardless, and when it broke, the galaxy would learn what it meant when a Deathworlder showed its claws. The first attack arrived without ceremony, a sudden collapse of communications from a mid-tier colony that supplied critical alloys to half the Council's fleets. Automated distress beacons flickered once and went silent. Patrol vessels dispatched to investigate were intercepted before they crossed the system's edge, their final transmissions nothing but bursts of static and fragmented sensor logs showing energy spikes from unknown weapon systems. The Council called an emergency session within hours. The chamber was thick with panic, disguised as procedure. Delegates who had dismissed Vale's warnings days earlier now spoke of unforeseen hostilities and tactical irregularities. None wanted to admit they had been wrong. The chair listed options: fortify core worlds, divert fleets from less critical sectors, issue a public assurance that the situation was contained. Every suggestion carried the same flaw. The enemy was already deep in Council space, moving faster than projected, and striking with coordination that no pirate bands or rogue states had ever demonstrated. Vale stood at the edge of the central dais and laid out the only workable strategy: decentralize fleet deployments, strike at suspected staging points before the enemy consolidated, and use small, high-mobility groups to harry supply lines. The proposal was met with a chorus of objections. Too risky, too aggressive, too reliant on untested intelligence. A delegate from the Kethri domain called it an undisciplined death charge. Vale countered with quiet precision, showing predictive maps that traced probable invasion vectors and listed projected loss totals if the Council chose slower, defensive measures. The numbers were brutal. Systems lost, populations displaced, entire supply chains severed. When the debate began circling into paralysis, Vale made their statement. Your enemy is already inside your walls. Every moment you spend debating is a system gone. There was no vote of confidence, only a narrow procedural decision to assign Vale temporary operational authority over a composite task force. Even that came with strings. Alien commanders embedded to observe, operational reports sent to Council after each engagement, restrictions on certain weapons deployments. Vale accepted without hesitation. The Council thought oversight would keep the human contained. Vale knew the only thing that mattered was the freedom to move fast. The task force assembled in the shadow of a barren moon near the conflict zone. The ships were an uneasy coalition: sleek Kethri interceptors, broad plenary carriers, nimble Iric corvettes, and a handful of human frigates bristling with modular weapon mounts. From the first day, friction was constant. Alien crews questioned every directive, muttered about reckless human instincts, and clung to the slower, more cautious fleet doctrines they had trained under for generations. Vale didn't argue doctrine in the mess halls. They demonstrated results. The first engagement was a probing strike on a suspected forward operating base. Council-trained captains expected to exchange fire at range and withdraw. Vale's formation punched through at close quarters, targeting munition storage and command relays in the opening minutes. The fight was over before most of the enemy fleet could maneuver, and the task force withdrew with no casualties. It did not erase the distrust, but it cracked the shell. After 3 more engagements of similar tempo, alien officers began to follow Vale's orders without lengthy debate. They saw the advantage of hitting hard and vanishing before the enemy regrouped. They saw that human aggression was not undisciplined fury, but calculated application of pressure at points the opponent could not defend. Each skirmish recovered intelligence: enemy encryption keys, navigational markers, and logs hinting at a much larger staging ground deeper into Council space. Vale pushed the task force further forward than the Council would have sanctioned, convinced that striking at the source was the only way to slow the momentum. The enemy adapted. Patrol patterns became less predictable. Decoy transmissions lured Council scouts into ambushes. A plenary cruiser under Vale's command barely escaped destruction after being drawn into a kill zone by a false distress call. Alien officers began muttering about retreating to fortified positions. Vale shut it down in the strategy chamber with a single sentence: "If you fall back now, you won't have a position to fortify." They laid out the enemy's probable plan: draw the Council fleets inward, then sever hyperlanes in a coordinated strike that would isolate entire regions. It was a strategy designed to win without ever having to destroy the bulk of the Council's ships. The only counter was to keep the enemy reacting, never letting them dictate the pace. The operation that followed would later be cited in military archives as the moment the Death Worlder reputation was cemented. Intelligence identified a mobile logistics convoy supplying multiple enemy strike groups. Vale ordered an attack deep in contested space, moving faster than the Council's own relay networks could keep up. Alien captains protested the lack of reinforcement plans, but Vale's intent was clear: hit the convoy before it reached its next rendezvous, force the enemy to reconfigure supply chains, and by the Council time to realign defenses. The task force emerged from hyperspace in the middle of the convoy's protective screen. Vale's ships split into strike elements, cutting through escort craft, targeting fuel pods and ammunition freighters. Enemy reinforcements arrived mid-battle. But instead of withdrawing, Vale redirected all available fire on the command ship, collapsing the convoy's coordination in minutes. The victory cost hull plating, munitions, and 3 wounded crew, but it destroyed enough supplies to stall the enemy's advance in that sector for weeks. Word of the battle spread faster than official reports. Crews from other fleets spoke in low tones about the humans' eyes on the tactical display, the way they shifted formation, as if reading the enemy's intent seconds before it unfolded. Alien tacticians dissected the battle and found no randomness, only precision disguised as chaos. For some, it was proof of humanity's dangerous adaptability. For others, it was the first real hope that the Council could survive. The enemy adjusted again, pulling back from obvious targets and concentrating forces in unpredictable patterns. It was a sign they now recognized human involvement as a serious threat. Vale knew that was dangerous. It meant they would begin planning specifically to counter human tactics. But it also meant the Council had finally drawn blood, and the initiative was no longer entirely in enemy hands. The question was whether the Council would allow the fight to continue on those terms, or retreat into the comfort of defensive walls and lose everything beyond them. Vale didn't intend to give them the choice. The enemy's next move was the one Vale had feared since the first whispers of invasion: a coordinated strike against the heart of the Council, Capital World, Central Communications, and the administrative fleet yards, all targeted at once. The attack began with diversionary raids on outer sectors, pulling away the bulk of the Council's defensive fleets. By the time core sensors registered the true assault vector, the enemy vanguard was already in system, accompanied by heavy carriers and siege platforms large enough to punch through planetary shields. The Council scrambled what forces it could, but the numbers were against them, and the chain of command fractured under the sudden pressure. In confusion, Vale moved without clearance, pulling every ship under their operational authority into an intercept course. Alien commanders in the formation received no time for discussion. Orders came sharp, time to the second, with vector changes that made little sense until patterns emerged in battle. Vale refused to fight on the enemy's terms. Instead of forming static defense lines, they split the task force into multiple assault groups, weaving between the enemy's larger formations, striking at fuel tenders, communication relays, and the command links that kept the siege fleet coordinated. Where the Council would have anchored around the capital and absorbed the blow, Vale aimed to cut the attack off at the neck before it fully closed its grip. The maneuvers looked suicidal to anyone trained in standard doctrine. Task Force ships darted within firing arcs of capital-class weapons, used debris field as cover, and deliberately overloaded shield arrays to punch through close-range exchanges. The alien crews who had once called human instincts reckless now executed each order without hesitation, trusting the rhythm Vale imposed on the chaos. Losses were inevitable, but the gains were undeniable. Enemy formations that should have been unbreakable scattered under relentless harassment, their timelines slipping as coordination failed. Still, the enemy adjusted with frightening speed. A concentrated wing of heavy cruisers pushed toward the capital's orbital defense grid, bypassing Vale's harassment teams. There was no time to wait for reinforcements. Vale ordered a direct strike against the enemy flagship, the command vessel orchestrating the entire assault. The plan required every available ship to clear a corridor for the strike craft, knowing full well the rest of the task force would be exposed in the process. It was a kind of move no Council admiral would risk, but it was a kind of move that could end the battle in a single blow. The approach was a gauntlet of overlapping weapons fire and hunter-killer drones. Several escort craft took critical hits, one spinning out of formation in flames. Vale's own ship led the charge, shields buckling under concentrated fire. They ignored it, driving into the flagship's defensive screen, ordering simultaneous strikes on its shield generators from multiple angles. With its defenses collapsing, Vale's boarding teams punched through an auxiliary hangar and took the fight inside. What followed was a kind of brutal, close-quarters combat most Council species avoided entirely. Alien soldiers who fought alongside humans before were still unprepared for the endurance, speed, and calculated brutality with which Vale's teams advanced through the ship. The fighting ended in the flagship's command chamber, where Vale personally oversaw the capture of the enemy's senior command staff. The moment the ship's control core was seized, the rest of the fleet faltered. Coordinated strikes in the task force dismantled the siege platforms and drove the surviving enemy ships into retreat. Across the system, relief was immediate, but so was the awareness of what it had taken to achieve. Every alien crew who had fought under Vale's command had seen the claws unsheathed, had seen what a Death Worlder could do when pushed to the edge of necessity. In the aftermath, the Council convened an emergency session, this time without the smug certainty of the past. Delegates who had once argued for restrictions now spoke of the need to adapt to the kind of warfare humanity had mastered. Others, still uneasy, urged caution, reminding the chamber that the same tactics could be turned against them if relations ever soured. The debate was quieter than usual, the weight of survival still fresh in the air. Vale stood before them not as a petitioner, but as a commander who had stopped their collapse. Their address was brief. You saw what we can do. That was for your enemies. Remember that. Keep it that way, and you'll have nothing to fear. The words were not a threat, but no one in the chamber missed a warning layered inside. Some nodded in grim agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. In the weeks that followed, the Council authorized new joint training programs, incorporating tactics once dismissed as dangerous. Fleet doctrines were revised. Borders were patrolled with an edge of readiness that hadn't existed before. Vale returned to Earth without ceremony. They left behind no speeches, no demands, only the memory of what had been done in the Council's darkest hour. in the distant sectors where the enemy had been driven back. Survivors spoke of the human commander in terms that mixed awe with fear. On the Capitol, whispers carried through the halls. The Death Worlder had shown its claws, and the galaxy would never forget. Beyond Council space, in the uncharted dark, there were still threats waiting. But word of the battle had spread, carried by traitors, mercenaries, and spies. The message was simple. The humans of Earth had been tested in war, and they had not broken. For the first time in living memory, the predators at the edge of the map hesitated before moving closer. The Council might not realize it yet, but their survival had bought them something rare in the galaxy, a pause. And that pause existed only because one Death Worlder had acted before anyone else could see the storm breaking. The claws were back in their sheath now, but everyone who had been there knew the truth. If the storm came again, they would be unsheathed without hesitation.